Have you ever watched someone spend millions of dollars building their dream on land they never owned? The first thing I noticed that morning was not the sound of applause. It was the steady rhythm of waves rolling against the brand-new marina as expensive yachts rocked gently beneath a cloudless Florida sky. Salt filled the air. Fresh cedar from 26 luxury cabins mixed with the smell of ocean breeze and newly planted palm trees. A string quartet played near the waterfront while waiters carried silver trays filled with sparkling drinks for investors celebrating what they proudly called the most exclusive private island resort on the East Coast. Everyone was smiling. Everyone believed history was being made. Standing alone at the end of the dock, wearing faded boat shoes, weathered jeans, and an old navy canvas jacket that had seen far better days, I watched Rebecca Hayes step onto a beautifully decorated stage surrounded by television cameras, real estate executives, county officials, and business partners who had invested fortunes into the project. Behind her stretched 26 perfectly finished waterfront cabins connected by polished wooden boardwalks, each one overlooking crystal blue water that my grandfather had taught me to navigate before I was old enough to drive a truck. Rebecca lifted the microphone with complete confidence and welcomed everyone to what she proudly described as the future of luxury island living. The crowd responded with enthusiastic applause that echoed across the bay. I never joined them. Instead, I quietly rested one hand on the worn leather portfolio tucked beneath my arm. Inside rested a single document that had spent decades inside my family before anyone standing on that island had ever imagined building a resort there. Funny how one sheet of aging paper could quietly outweigh millions of dollars in lumber, steel, glass, permits, marketing campaigns, and investor confidence. Most people looked at the island and saw paradise. I saw my childhood. I remembered fishing from those same docks when they were nothing more than weathered wooden pilings. I remembered collecting seashells with my grandfather along the western shoreline every summer while he explained why owning land was never about showing wealth. It was about protecting something that could never be replaced. Every tide that rolled across those beaches carried another memory. Every breeze through the sea grapes reminded me why my family had never sold the island despite countless offers over the years. Now luxury golf carts carried invited guests between cabins that legally stood on property still recorded under my family's name. Nobody seemed to question it because success has a strange way of making assumptions feel like facts. A giant blue ribbon stretched across the entrance to the marina, waiting for Rebecca's oversized ceremonial scissors. Reporters adjusted camera lenses. Investors straightened expensive jackets. Drone cameras hovered overhead to capture the celebration from every angle. I simply watched in silence because I had spent the last 8 months waiting for this exact morning. Not for revenge. Not for revenge at all. I was waiting for certainty. I wanted every cabin completed, every contract signed, every reservation accepted, every congratulatory speech delivered before anyone discovered that the most valuable part of this entire resort had never belonged to the people standing on the stage. As Rebecca smiled toward the cameras and reached for the ribbon, I quietly opened my leather portfolio and looked down at the original warranty deed that my grandfather had signed decades before this island ever became someone else's dream. My name is Daniel Carter. I am 41 years old, a marine engineer by profession, and the legal owner of an island that had belonged to my family for nearly 60 years before anyone dreamed of turning it into a luxury destination. My grandfather, Harold Carter, bought the island in 1966 from a retired commercial fisherman who wanted nothing more than a quiet life on the mainland. Back then there were no polished docks, no waterfront cabins, no electric golf carts carrying wealthy visitors beneath rows of decorative palm trees. There was only white sand, dense coastal pines, sea grape bushes, and a weathered wooden pier that creaked every time the tide rolled in. Some of my earliest memories came from that island. I learned to steer a small fishing boat before I learned algebra. I learned how to read changing tides before I could read engineering blueprints. Every summer my grandfather and I walked the shoreline collecting driftwood while he explained that the ocean was always changing, but good records never did. At the time, I thought he was simply talking about paperwork because he loved organizing folders almost as much as he loved fishing. Every property tax receipt went into a labeled envelope. Every survey map stayed inside a waterproof tube. Every letter from the county recorder found its place inside a steel lockbox that never left the old island house. I used to tease him about saving papers nobody would ever care about. He would smile, adjust the brim of his faded fishing hat, and tell me that land could survive storms, but ownership survived only if somebody protected the evidence. Years later, those words became impossible to forget. After graduating from college, I accepted engineering projects all along the Gulf Coast, designing marinas, seawalls, and coastal infrastructure. My work kept me traveling from one shoreline to another, but every few months I returned to the island to inspect the property, repair the old dock, and make certain the taxes remained current. I never considered selling it, even after developers offered astonishing amounts of money. To me, it was never just real estate. It was the place where my family celebrated birthdays, watched dolphins swim through the bay at sunrise, and scattered my grandfather's ashes exactly where he had asked. Every visit reminded me why some places carry value that cannot be measured by market prices. Even while living hundreds of miles away for work, every official county record continued listing my name as the legal owner. Property taxes were paid every year without delay. Insurance remained active. Survey markers stayed documented. The island never disappeared from my responsibilities simply because I was not standing on it every weekend. That was why the first photograph showing construction equipment arriving by barge caught my attention immediately. At first, I assumed someone had delivered materials to the wrong island. Then another photograph appeared showing temporary fencing along my shoreline. By the third image, I realized something far more unbelievable was unfolding. Someone had begun building an entire resort on property that had never stopped belonging to my family. Rebecca Hayes had built her reputation on making impossible projects look effortless. At 56, she had become one of the most recognizable figures in the coastal real estate community, not because she was loud, but because she always appeared completely certain. She wore tailored business suits even while walking construction sites, carried neatly organized development binders beneath one arm, and spoke with the calm confidence of someone who expected every room to agree with her before she finished a sentence. Before becoming president of Seabreeze Cove Homeowners Association, she had spent years helping investors transform waterfront communities into luxury destinations. Every successful project strengthened her belief that growth solved every problem. When Seabreeze Cove began attracting affluent homeowners, she envisioned something even larger than another upscale neighborhood. She wanted an exclusive private island resort that would place the entire community on magazine covers and luxury travel websites across the country. Her presentations featured elegant architectural renderings of waterfront cabins connected by wooden boardwalks, private beaches lined with palm trees, solar-powered pathways, boutique restaurants overlooking the bay, and a marina capable of welcoming large yachts. Investors applauded the vision. Developers competed for contracts. County officials praised the potential economic benefits. The only challenge was finding an island large enough to support the project while remaining close to the mainland. During one planning meeting, someone produced an outdated development map that shaded my island the same color as neighboring parcels already involved in the expansion. Nobody questioned the boundary. Nobody requested a fresh title review. Nobody compared the map with the current county ownership records. Momentum quietly replaced verification. Rebecca treated the island as though it had already become part of the development long before a single construction barge crossed the water. I first realized how serious the mistake had become while reviewing publicly available planning documents from my office hundreds of miles away. The drawings displayed the outline of my island beneath proposed resort infrastructure, yet the legal property description referred only to a larger coastal development area instead of identifying each individual parcel. As an engineer, I had spent my career reading technical drawings, survey coordinates, and coastal mapping data. Something about those documents felt incomplete. The graphics looked polished, but the legal foundation beneath them seemed surprisingly thin. Curious, I drove to the county records office during my next trip home and quietly reviewed every filing connected to the resort proposal. Permit applications, environmental studies, marina layouts, drainage plans, and utility extensions filled several folders, yet nowhere did I find a recorded transfer showing that my family had ever sold the island. Every official ownership record still listed my name exactly where it had appeared for years. I walked back into the warm afternoon sunlight, carrying nothing except a notebook filled with dates, permit numbers, and observations. Most people would have marched directly into the developer's office, demanding immediate answers. I simply closed the notebook, looked across the bay toward the island where survey boats had already begun placing temporary markers, and realized Rebecca was not building on abandoned property. She was building on confidence, assumptions, and paperwork that had never actually proven ownership. That difference would eventually matter far more than anyone involved could possibly imagine. The first construction barge arrived just after sunrise on a calm Tuesday morning. From the mainland marina, I watched through binoculars as tugboats carefully guided floating platforms loaded with excavators, lumber, steel beams, and heavy equipment toward my island. The salty air carried the low rumble of diesel engines across the water while seabirds circled overhead, briefly disturbed before settling back onto the shoreline they had claimed for years. Within hours, temporary docks appeared where my grandfather and I had once tied our little fishing boat after long afternoons chasing redfish through the shallow flats. I remained exactly where I was, saying nothing, simply observing every movement with the same patience my grandfather had practiced throughout his life. Every few days I returned with a camera, documenting each stage from public waterways where I had every legal right to be. I photographed supply barges arriving before dawn, construction crews unloading pallets of building materials, survey boats placing navigation markers, and contractors assembling boardwalk foundations across sand that still legally belonged to my family. Back home, every photograph received a date, time, weather conditions, and GPS reference before being stored inside carefully organized folders. Weeks slowly became months. The quiet island I had known since childhood transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Wooden walkways stretched between towering palm trees. Decorative lighting lined the paths leading toward newly framed cabins. Solar panels reflected bright afternoon sunlight, while craftsmen installed oversized windows overlooking the bay. Luxury landscaping replaced native coastal vegetation. The smell of fresh cedar mixed with ocean salt every time the wind shifted toward the mainland. Construction crews worked efficiently because they believed they were creating something permanent. Investors visited by private boat wearing polished shoes completely unsuited for sandy beaches. Architects pointed proudly toward computer renderings while explaining future guest experiences. Rebecca arrived almost every Friday morning, greeting developers with confident handshakes before touring the site inside electric utility carts. She often stood near the highest point on the island, smiling toward the water as though admiring a vision she alone had created. From a distance, she looked completely certain that every decision rested on solid ground. My attorney contacted me after the sixth cabin reached completion. He had reviewed the county ownership records himself and recommended filing an immediate legal action before additional construction continued. He explained that courts generally appreciated prompt responses in property disputes and warned that every passing week increased the financial complexity surrounding the project. I listened carefully because his advice was completely reasonable. Then I looked through another folder containing hundreds of photographs showing each new improvement added to my island. I thanked him sincerely and asked him to wait a little longer. He paused before quietly asking whether I truly understood how much money had already been invested. I looked across the bay through my office window toward another construction barge carrying roofing materials and answered without hesitation. Yes, I understood exactly how much they had invested. That was precisely why I intended to remain patient. Every completed cabin, every finished boardwalk, every signed contractor invoice, every scheduled reservation, and every congratulatory announcement strengthened something far more valuable than the resort itself. They believed they were building a destination. Without realizing it, they were building the strongest evidence my family could ever bring before a court of law. By the beginning of the 8th month, the island looked nothing like the quiet place where my grandfather had taught me to cast a fishing line. 26 waterfront cabins stood finished beneath rows of swaying palm trees, each one fully furnished with handcrafted furniture, polished hardwood floors, and wide glass windows facing the bay. A boutique restaurant overlooked the marina. The reception building displayed a carved wooden sign welcoming future guests. Landscapers rolled out fresh green grass, while maintenance crews planted flowering shrubs along every walkway. At sunset, the pathway lights reflected across the calm water, making the entire island glow like something from a luxury travel magazine. The transformation was remarkable, and I could not deny the quality of the work. The developers had spared no expense. Every improvement increased the value of the property that still legally belonged to me. Reservation announcements soon appeared across travel websites. Promotional videos showed couples walking along the boardwalks, families enjoying private beaches, and boats docking beside the new marina. Local newspapers praised the project as a major economic success for the coastal community. Investors celebrated nearly every cabin being reserved months before the official opening. Banks finalized financing. Insurance policies became active. Supply contracts were signed. Catering companies booked opening week events. Every new agreement quietly added another layer to a project that had been built upon one mistaken assumption. My attorney called again after reading another article celebrating the resort. He sounded more concerned than before. He reminded me that every additional contract meant more people would eventually become involved once ownership was challenged. He asked the same question he had asked months earlier. Why wait? I walked into my home office without answering immediately. Against one wall stood a steel filing cabinet beside the old lockbox that had belonged to my grandfather. I unlocked it and carefully spread decades of records across the desk. Property tax receipts arrived without interruption year after year. Updated survey maps matched federal coastal coordinates perfectly. Recorded ownership documents connected one generation to the next without a single missing transfer. Even utility easements and shoreline maintenance permits remained neatly organized. Looking at those papers, I finally understood what my grandfather had been preparing me for all those years. He had never expected conflict. He simply believed that if conflict ever arrived, facts would matter more than emotions. I called my attorney back later that afternoon. Before he could repeat his recommendation, I asked him a different question. Had the grand opening been scheduled yet? There was a brief silence before he answered that invitations had already been sent to investors, county officials, business leaders, and regional news stations. I thanked him and told him that was the day I wanted to act. He sounded surprised, but he trusted my judgment. I was not waiting because I enjoyed watching someone else succeed on my land. I was waiting because the truth deserved the largest audience possible. When the time finally came, there would be no angry confrontation, no dramatic shouting, and no rushed accusations. There would simply be complete records, lawful ownership, and one undeniable chain of evidence that had existed long before the first shovel ever touched the sand. Every ribbon they prepared to cut, every speech they rehearsed, and every celebration they planned only brought that moment one step closer. 2 days before the grand opening, I drove back to the island before sunrise, tying my old fishing boat to the same temporary public dock I had been using for months. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the cabins like polished glass. Seagulls drifted above the marina while workers hurried across the boardwalk carrying flower arrangements, patio furniture, and final decorations. The entire resort felt alive with anticipation. Fresh paint still lingered in the air, blending with the familiar scent of salt water and cedar that had always reminded me of childhood. Nobody paid much attention to me because I looked like another local fisherman stopping to admire the new development. That anonymity was strangely comforting. I slowly walked along the public shoreline, taking in every finished detail. The cabins looked beautiful beneath the morning sunlight. Each porch faced the bay exactly where my grandfather and I used to watch dolphins surface during early summer mornings. The restaurant overlooked the same stretch of water where we once cleaned our fishing catch at the end of every weekend. Even the stone pathways followed routes that I could still navigate with my eyes closed because I had walked them since I was a little boy. The island had changed almost completely, yet beneath every new improvement remained the same property boundaries my grandfather had carefully preserved decades earlier. Later that afternoon, I returned home and unlocked the old steel lockbox one final time. Inside rested the original warranty deed wrapped in protective paper exactly as my grandfather had left it. The ink had faded slightly with age, but every signature remained perfectly clear. Beneath it sat certified survey maps showing precise boundary coordinates, recorded tax receipts stretching back year after year, probate records transferring ownership to me after my grandfather passed away, and certified county filings confirming that the title had never left our family. I placed every document into protective sleeves before organizing them inside the same worn leather portfolio I had carried to the marina. There was nothing dramatic about the process. It felt more like honoring a promise. My grandfather had spent a lifetime protecting those records because he believed ownership depended on responsibility as much as law. Now it was my responsibility to finish what he had quietly prepared. My attorney arrived at my house that evening carrying several additional certified copies obtained directly from the county recorder. We reviewed every page together across my dining room table. Dates matched perfectly. Survey references aligned with federal coastal mapping records. Property tax payments showed no interruptions. Chain of title remained complete from the original purchase until the present day. When we finally finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time since this situation had begun. He admitted he had never seen ownership documentation assembled so thoroughly. Before leaving, he reminded me that once we entered court, emotions would not determine the outcome. Evidence would. I nodded because that had been my grandfather's lesson all along. As darkness settled outside, lights from the completed resort shimmered across the bay like a small coastal town preparing for celebration. Music echoed faintly over the water as staff rehearsed for the opening ceremony. Somewhere across the island, Rebecca Hayes was probably practicing another confident speech about vision, investment, and success. Meanwhile, I quietly closed the leather portfolio, locked it beside the front door, and set my alarm before going to bed with an unexpected sense of peace. By the next afternoon, the entire audience would finally learn that the most important foundation beneath every cabin had never been concrete at all. It had always been a single legal document that no amount of construction could ever replace. The grand opening arrived beneath a bright blue sky without a single cloud in sight, almost as if the weather itself had decided to celebrate what everyone believed was a flawless success. By mid-morning, the marina was crowded with polished yachts flying colorful flags, while luxury cars filled every parking space on the mainland ferry terminal. Guests stepped onto private shuttle boats dressed in linen jackets, summer dresses, and tailored suits, laughing as they admired the sparkling water surrounding the island. Local television crews adjusted cameras near the entrance, reporters rehearsed introductions into handheld microphones, and photographers searched for the perfect angle to capture the ribbon cutting. The excitement spread through the crowd like a rising tide. Investors congratulated one another over cups of fresh coffee. County officials shook hands with business leaders. Real estate executives proudly discussed future expansion plans that would supposedly transform the coastline for generations. Rebecca Hayes moved confidently through the celebration, greeting nearly everyone by name. She looked completely at ease, stopping often for photographs while thanking contractors, architects, and financial partners for turning an ambitious vision into reality. From a distance, she looked exactly like someone standing at the highest point of a remarkable career. I arrived quietly on the second passenger shuttle of the morning, carrying nothing except my weathered leather portfolio. Nobody stopped me because the island was open to invited guests, media representatives, and local community members attending the ceremony. I walked slowly across the polished boardwalk, listening to live music drifting through hidden outdoor speakers while the familiar smell of cedar blended with sea salt carried by the breeze. Every few steps, another memory returned. Beneath one newly planted palm tree had once stood the old picnic table where my grandfather cleaned fresh fish after long afternoons on the water. The marina office occupied the exact place where our small storage shed had protected fishing nets from summer storms. Even the decorative stone path leading toward the stage followed the same gentle curve I had walked countless times as a child. Nothing could erase those memories, no matter how elegant the construction had become. My attorney arrived a few minutes later dressed in a simple navy suit, carrying a slim briefcase filled with certified copies of every supporting record we had assembled. We exchanged only a brief handshake because there was nothing left to discuss. Everything that needed preparation had already been completed long before today. Across the lawn, Rebecca stepped onto the stage as applause spread through the audience. Behind her stretched 26 completed cabins reflecting sunlight across the calm bay like polished jewels. She welcomed everyone with confident remarks about vision, cooperation, responsible development, and a prosperous future for the entire coastal community. Each sentence earned another round of applause. I simply listened in silence while resting one hand against the leather portfolio beneath my arm. My heartbeat remained steady because I was not waiting for the perfect argument. I was waiting for the perfect moment. As Rebecca thanked the investors for believing in the project, I noticed several judges from the county civil court seated among invited officials, along with attorneys representing financial institutions and title insurance companies. Seeing them gathered together confirmed that I had chosen exactly the right day. Before the afternoon ended, every important witness to the resort's greatest celebration would also become the first witnesses to the truth that had been patiently waiting beneath every boardwalk, every cabin, every contract, and every carefully rehearsed speech from the very beginning. The applause had barely faded when my attorney quietly touched my elbow and nodded toward the county courthouse across the bay. Everything had already been arranged according to the legal schedule we had filed that morning. The celebration continued behind us while we boarded a small ferry carrying attorneys, county representatives, and several individuals whose signatures appeared throughout the development paperwork. Rebecca remained confident as she arrived with her legal team, still believing the matter involved nothing more than a routine property disagreement that would disappear after a brief explanation. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere could not have been more different from the excitement on the island. There were no cameras, no music, and no speeches. Only polished wooden benches, neatly organized case files, and the quiet professionalism of a civil court preparing to examine facts instead of assumptions. The judge greeted both parties and asked each side to present its documentation. Rebecca's attorneys began by describing the resort project, the economic investment, the construction timeline, environmental approvals, financing agreements, and the expectation that the development had been planned in good faith. Their presentation was organized, detailed, and supported by stacks of contracts involving builders, lenders, consultants, and investors. I listened respectfully because none of those documents were false. They accurately described everything that had been built. They simply did not answer the one question that mattered most. Who legally owned the island before the first piece of equipment ever arrived? When our turn came, my attorney stood without raising his voice and placed a single leather portfolio on the counsel table. One by one, he removed the original warranty deed, certified copies of the recorded chain of title, probate documents transferring ownership into my name, property tax records showing uninterrupted payment for decades, certified survey maps matching federal coastal coordinates, and current county ownership records obtained directly from the recorder's office only days earlier. Each exhibit was handed to the clerk before being presented to the judge. The courtroom became noticeably quieter with every page that entered the official record. The judge carefully compared legal descriptions, parcel numbers, survey references, recording dates, and ownership history. He asked several straightforward questions regarding whether any deed transferring the island away from my family had ever been recorded. After reviewing every filing available through the county system, the answer remained exactly the same. No such transfer existed. Rebecca's attorneys requested time to examine the documents more closely. They compared signatures, recording stamps, legal descriptions, and survey coordinates, searching for an inconsistency that never appeared. The maps aligned perfectly. The ownership history remained complete without interruption. The tax records confirmed continuous responsibility. Even the resort's own construction drawings identified the same parcel boundaries shown within my grandfather's original documentation. The realization slowly spread across the room that millions of dollars in planning, construction, financing, and celebration had been built upon an assumption that no one had fully verified. The judge finally closed the last folder, looked across the courtroom, and explained in a calm, measured voice that property ownership could not be replaced by confidence, investment, or good intentions. It rested upon lawful titles supported by properly recorded evidence. Every document presented by my family pointed to one unmistakable conclusion. The island beneath every completed cabin remained legally mine, exactly as it had been for generations before the first construction barge ever crossed the water. When we stepped outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was beginning to settle over the bay, casting a warm golden light across the water that surrounded the island my grandfather had loved his entire life. The same island that had been celebrated only hours earlier now stood quietly in the distance, unchanged by headlines, court filings, or public opinion. The cabins were still there. The marina still welcomed boats. The boardwalks still stretched between rows of palm trees. Nothing about the island itself had changed. Only the truth behind it had finally become visible. News of the court's decision spread quickly through the people who had attended the grand opening. Investors gathered with attorneys to understand what would happen next. Financial institutions began reviewing their agreements. Contractors examined their records. County officials quietly discussed how such an important ownership question had gone unnoticed before construction ever began. Throughout all of it, I remained remarkably calm because none of this felt like winning a battle. It felt like finishing a promise my grandfather had started decades earlier when he carefully stored every deed, every survey, every tax receipt, and every legal document inside that old steel lockbox. Rebecca Hayes eventually walked toward me near the courthouse steps. For the first time since I had met her, she no longer carried the confidence that had defined every public appearance during the project. She simply looked exhausted. After a long silence, she admitted that everyone involved had trusted old assumptions instead of verifying current ownership records. She said they had believed the paperwork was already settled long before construction began. I nodded because I already knew that was exactly what had happened. Confidence had replaced confirmation. Ambition had moved faster than careful research. I told her something my grandfather used to repeat whenever we finished organizing property records at the kitchen table. Good neighbors respect fences. Wise owners respect documents. She looked toward the island one last time before quietly walking away with her legal team. Over the following months, the legal process continued exactly as the court required. Agreements were reviewed, responsibilities were sorted through lawful procedures, and future arrangements were handled by attorneys representing every interested party. The improvements that had been built did not disappear. Instead, they became part of the property that the court had confirmed belonged to my family all along. Standing once again on the island several weeks later, I walked slowly across the polished boardwalk as gentle waves rolled beneath the docks. The cabins reflected beautifully across the calm water, and for a brief moment I imagined my grandfather smiling at how peaceful everything had become. He never cared about luxury resorts or expensive developments. He cared about stewardship, patience, and leaving things better documented than he had found them. Looking around, I realized that every lesson he had taught me while fishing, repairing old docks, and organizing faded paperwork had led to this exact moment. People often believe justice arrives with loud arguments and dramatic confrontations, but my experience taught me something very different. Real justice often arrives quietly, carried inside an old leather portfolio, supported by decades of careful preparation, and confirmed by facts that never needed to raise their voices. They believed they were building someone else's dream destination, but in the end they had preserved my family's legacy, proving once again that patience, preparation, and the truth will always stand longer than assumptions.